There are confessions that destroy, and there are confessions that, if received with the right kind of courage by the right kind of person, become the first honest sentence of a different and better story. Bernard Whitfield had been living inside the wrong story for a long time, not because he did not love his wife. He did, but because loving someone and being fully alive in the life you have built with them are not always the same condition, and Bernard had confused the two for long enough that the difference had become the quiet center of everything he could not explain about himself. He had not planned to say what he said on that stage. He had not planned to say it anywhere, to anyone ever, but sometimes the truth finds the room it needs regardless of whether you have chosen it. Steve Harvey found that room on a Thursday afternoon, and what he did with what he found there is the reason this story has not stopped being told. Her name was Loretta Whitfield. She was 57 years old, a high school choir director from St. Louis, Missouri, who had spent 31 years building the musical lives of teenagers who came to her program from every possible background and left it with something they had not arrived with. Not just the ability to read music or hold a part, but the specific confidence of a person who has learned to produce something beautiful in the company of others. She had won state competitions. She had sent students to conservatories. She had run the same program through budget cuts and administrative indifference and a global pandemic, and had emerged from each with the choir intact, if smaller, and with the conviction that the work was worth whatever it cost. She was a woman of deep feeling expressed through controlled form. The particular combination that makes a great choral director and that also, in the context of a long marriage, can make it difficult to distinguish between the discipline that serves her and the suppression that costs her. She gave everything to the music and to the students and to the household with the same full-hearted commitment, and she had, over 30 years of marriage, become so practiced at giving that she had largely stopped accounting for what came back. Her husband was Bernard Whitfield. He was 61, a recently retired operations manager from the City Transit Authority who had spent 33 years in a role that suited his temperament, logistics-minded, systems-oriented, more comfortable with the predictable machinery of large organizations than with the less navigable territory of his own interior life. He had retired 14 months before the taping, at a moment when the structure that had organized his days, his sense of purpose, and his understanding of who he was had been removed all at once, and he had found himself in the unfamiliar position of having nothing left to manage except the life he was actually living. Retirement, for Bernard, had been the beginning of a reckoning that he had not anticipated and did not know how to conduct. Stripped of the transit authority, stripped of the title and the schedule and the daily evidence that he was useful and capable and known, he had been left alone with the questions he had kept at arm's length for decades. Questions about whether the life he had constructed had been built toward what he actually wanted or toward what he had been taught to want. Questions about whether the marriage, solid, functional, warmly maintained, was the right marriage, in the specific sense of whether he and Loretta had ever been the right people for each other, or whether they had been two good people who had chosen each other before they were old enough to know what choosing meant. These were not new questions. They were very old ones, but the transit authority had made them easy to defer. Their children were LaShonda, 33, who worked as a hospital administrator in Kansas City and who had always been closer to her mother in temperament and in practice, and Jerome, 29, who was in graduate school for urban planning in Chicago, and who had always been closer to his father in the way of sons who recognize themselves in a parent's quietness without fully understanding what the quiet contains. Both children had come for the taping. LaShonda had organized the trip. Jerome had driven in the night before. The Family Feud application had been submitted by Loretta herself, 8 months earlier, as a birthday present to Bernard, a gesture rooted in the belief that what her husband needed, in the early disorientation of retirement, was something playful and communal and forward-looking. She had submitted it with love. She had no way of knowing what the afternoon would produce. The Whitfield family arrived at the studio with the composed, organized energy of a family that had traveled together before and knew how to coordinate. Loretta moved through the pre-show warm-up with the ease of a woman who had spent 31 years performing in front of audiences. Comfortable in public space, natural with strangers, present without performing. Bernard was quieter. He had been quieter for 14 months. The family had become accustomed to the new register of him, the slightly withdrawn quality of a man still finding his footing in the changed landscape of his days, and they moved around it with the gentle accommodation of people who love someone who is struggling and are waiting for him to find his way through. Steve Harvey noticed the quiet within the first 5 minutes. He noticed it not because it was unusual. Plenty of contestants are nervous, are reserved, are simply not the loud personality in their family, but because it was a specific kind of quiet. The quiet of containment rather than temperament. The quiet of a man holding something. The game was played well. Loretta was fast and accurate, her musical training evident in the quickness with which she processed patterns and produced responses. LaShonda was sharp and competitive. Jerome was thoughtful in the manner of someone accustomed to long-form analysis, occasionally arriving at the right answer a half-second after someone else. Bernard played competently, answering when called upon and deferring to others in the way of a man who has decided that his primary role in the group is not to lead it. They won the main game and advanced to fast money. The mood was good. Loretta was pleased. The children were loose and happy. Bernard smiled at the right moments. It was during the pre-fast money conversation, the segment where Steve sits down with the family and talks before the final round, that the texture of the afternoon changed. Steve had been asking Bernard about retirement. It was a natural question given his age and the recent nature of the transition, and Bernard had been giving the expected answers. That it was an adjustment, that he was finding his rhythm, that he had more time for the things that mattered now. Steve had been nodding along in the way he nods when he is listening, and also waiting for the thing beneath the answer. "What's the hardest part?" Steve asked. Bernard looked at his hands. He looked at Loretta beside him, at the ease and competence with which she occupied the space, the same ease and competence she had always occupied every space they had shared, which he had always admired and which, in the 14 months of retirement, had taken on a quality he could not fully explain. He looked at his children. Jerome had his father's quietness and was watching him with the specific attention of a son who had been watching carefully for 14 months without knowing exactly what he was watching for. "The hardest part," Bernard said, and his voice had shifted into something that was not the conversational register of the previous exchanges, "is realizing how much of yourself you put into work and how little is left over when the work is gone. You think you've been building a life, and then the job is over, and you look at the life and you realize that a lot of it was the job, and without the job you're not entirely sure who you are." It was honest. Steve received it without deflecting. "And at home?" he asked. "What's it like at home without the structure?" Bernard was quiet for a moment that stretched past the comfortable length. "It's like being asked a question you've been avoiding for 30 years, he said. "And the question is whether the life you built is the life you would have chosen if you had known yourself better when you started building it." The room had gone quieter. Loretta was looking at her husband. Steve Harvey said nothing. He was giving the silence room. "I love Loretta," Bernard said. The sentence was true, and it was also, in the way he said it, insufficient, and everyone who was paying attention could hear the insufficiency. "I have always loved her. But I have been sitting with something for the last year that I have not been able to say out loud, and I think—" He stopped. He looked at his wife. "I think I need to say it out loud, because the not saying it has been its own kind of damage." Loretta's expression had not changed. It was the expression of a woman who had been directing choral music for 31 years and knew what it meant when a voice was preparing to go somewhere difficult. "I think I have regret," Bernard said. "Not about you, not about who you are, but about the fact that I let us get married before I understood myself well enough to know whether I was choosing you fully or whether I was choosing the idea of a life that you happened to be part of. And I don't know how to tell the difference anymore, and I haven't known for a long time, and that is not fair to you. It has never been fair to you. The silence that followed was the fullest silence of any afternoon on that stage. Steve Harvey looked at Bernard Whitfield with the expression of a man who had just witnessed something that required more than the standard hospitality of a host. Steve Harvey did not reach for comfort. He did not try to soften the edges of what had just been said or redirect the room toward something more manageable. He understood, with the authority of a man who had spoken publicly about his own marital failures and his own seasons of not knowing himself well enough to love someone properly, that what Bernard Whitfield had just produced was not a crisis to be managed but a truth to be honored, and that honoring it meant staying in it rather than moving past it. He turned to Loretta. "I have to ask you something," he said gently, "because your husband just said something that most people spend their entire lives not saying out loud, and I want to know if it surprises you." Loretta was quiet for a moment. The practiced composure of the choral director was present, but beneath it something more human was visible. Not pain exactly, more like the expression of a person recognizing a landscape they have crossed many times in the dark and are now seeing in the light for the first time. "It does not surprise me," she said. "I have felt the question in him for a long time. I did not know the exact shape of it, but I have felt it." Steve nodded. Then he turned back to Bernard. "I want to say something to you," Steve said, "and I need you to hear all of it before you respond." He paused. "What you just did took a kind of courage that is rare. Most men in your position, most people in your position, spend the rest of their lives inside the question you just spoke out loud. They manage it. They keep it quiet. They tell themselves that as long as they don't say it, it isn't fully real." He looked at Bernard steadily. "The fact that you said it, here, in front of your wife, in front of your children, in front of all of us, that is not a betrayal of your marriage. That is the first honest thing you may have said about it in years." Bernard was listening with total stillness. "But I want to push you on something," Steve continued. "You said you regret marrying Loretta because you didn't know yourself well enough when you chose her. And I want to ask you, who did you want to be? When you imagine the self you didn't know yet, the one that might have chosen differently, who is that man? What does he want that this man doesn't have?" It was the question that had never been asked. The specific, concrete question underneath the abstract language of regret and self-knowledge. Bernard opened his mouth and then closed it, and in the closing of it the audience could see something important happening. The realization, arriving in real time, that the answer was not as clear as the question had seemed to promise. "I don't know," Bernard said finally. "That's important," Steve said, "because regret tells you that something is wrong. It does not tell you what the right thing would have been. And a man who spent 33 years managing a transit system knows the difference between identifying a problem and identifying a solution." He paused. "You have identified that you are in pain. You have not identified that the source of that pain is your marriage or your wife. What you have identified is that retirement took away the structure that was keeping you from having to ask hard questions. And the hard questions arrived all at once, and your marriage was the nearest thing." The room absorbed this. Loretta had turned to look at her husband with an expression that had moved from the landscape of recognition into something more open. Not forgiveness, which was not yet what was being asked for, but attention. The specific, generous attention of a woman who was willing to hear more. Jerome, from the edge of the stage, had both hands pressed together in front of his mouth. LaShonda had her arm around her mother's shoulders. Steve turned to Bernard one final time. "You owe your wife something," he said. "Not an unsaying of what you said. That ship has sailed and the truth is on the water. You owe her the full version of what you just started, the version that includes not just the regret but the love underneath it, and the fear underneath the love, and the genuine uncertainty of a man who is 61 years old and finally, trying to understand himself." He paused, because that man, the man who is willing to do that work at 61, that is a man worth being married to, if you will do the work. Bernard looked at Loretta. "I don't know who I would have been," he said quietly, "but I know who you are, and I know that every good thing I have built, as a father, as a person, has been built in proximity to you. Whether that is the same as having chosen you the right way, I genuinely do not know, but I know that I do not want to build whatever comes next without you in it." He paused, "And I am sorry that I have been carrying this in silence for so long that the only place I could say it was here." Loretta looked at her husband for a long, full moment. Then she said, in the voice she used for the most difficult passages, controlled, clear, carrying everything, "I have been waiting for you to come back to yourself. I did not know that was what I was waiting for, but I think that is what this is." Steve Harvey faced the cameras. "There is a version of love that is comfortable and sustained and never fully honest," he said. "And there is a version that requires two people to sit in the most uncertain room in the world together and choose each other anyway. Not from innocence, not from the easy confidence of people who have never asked hard questions, but from the full knowledge of who the other person is and who you are and what you are both still becoming." He looked at the audience. "That second version is harder. It is also the only one that lasts." Loretta Whitfield played the fast money round alone. Bernard offered to go, and she had looked at him with a calm, considered expression and said that she would like to do this one. She scored 171 points, not enough to win the 20,000 without a strong second round, but a score that the production staff noted was among the highest single-player totals of the season. When Bernard stepped to the podium and was asked the same 5 questions, he answered them with a focus that had not been present in his earlier playing, the concentration of a man who had just emptied himself of something large and was now, for the first time in a long time, simply present in the room. Their combined total won the prize. It was the least important outcome of the afternoon. The episode aired on a Tuesday evening. By Wednesday morning, the segment had moved through the internet with the particular velocity that belongs to things that articulate an experience more precisely than the people having it have been able to manage on their own. The specific community it reached most deeply was the community of people in the early years of retirement, men and women in their late 50s and early 60s who had spent decades deferring the interior work that professional life made deferrable, and who were now, in the sudden spaciousness of unstructured days, encountering the accumulated questions with no preparation and no map. A therapist who specialized in late-life transitions and retirement adjustment wrote a widely shared piece in the weeks following the broadcast. She described what Bernard had articulated, the experience of retirement as an involuntary reckoning with the self, as one of the most underaddressed phenomena in adult psychology, a period of profound identity disruption that professional culture did not provide adequate language or support for, and that frequently expressed itself through marital crisis, depression, or both. She cited the episode as the most public and precise articulation of the experience she had encountered in a non-clinical context. The piece was shared extensively in retirement planning communities by financial advisors who understood that the psychological dimensions of the transition were as significant as the financial ones, and by adult children who recognized in Bernard's description the quiet struggle of a parent they had been watching without fully understanding. Bernard and Loretta began couples therapy 3 weeks after the episode aired, with a therapist who specialized in late-life couples and identity transition. Loretta had found the therapist. Bernard had agreed without hesitation, a departure from the pattern of his previous 15 months and one that Loretta described, in later conversations, as the most meaningful indicator of change she had observed in him. The therapy was not rapid or tidy. The questions Bernard had raised on that stage were real questions, and real questions do not resolve on a broadcast schedule. What the therapy did, according to both participants, was provide a structure in which the questions could be examined with precision rather than avoided with business, which had, for 33 years, been Bernard's primary coping mechanism. 6 months after the episode, Loretta was asked in a brief interview whether she was glad Bernard had said what he said on that stage. Her answer was immediate and unequivocal. "Yes," she said. "I am glad he said it in front of people, because saying it in front of people meant he could not take it back or soften it or manage it into something more comfortable the next morning. I have been living with a man who was not fully present in our marriage for a long time, and I had accepted that as the shape of him. What happened on that stage told me that the absence was not the shape of him. It was the cost of a silence he had been maintaining. That is a different thing entirely. That is a thing that can be addressed. She paused. I am 61 years old. I have 30 years of choral work and a marriage and 2 children I am deeply proud of. I am not going to throw any of that away because my husband finally found the courage to ask the question he should have asked years ago. What I am going to do is stay at the table while he finds the answer. That is what I signed up for. The full thing, not the comfortable version. Jerome, in a conversation with a colleague that was later shared, described watching his father speak on that stage as the most significant experience of his adult understanding of his parents. I have always known my father was quiet, he said. I understood that as a personality trait. What I did not understand is that the quiet was a holding pattern, that there was something in there he had been circling for decades. Watching him land it, in public, in front of my mother, that changed how I understand what marriage is. It is not a destination. It is a question you keep asking honestly for as long as you are both willing to sit with the asking. LaShonda, characteristically more direct than her brother, said simply, My mother deserved the honest version of my father years ago. I am glad she is getting it now. Bernard Whitfield spent the months following the episode doing what Steve Harvey had suggested. The full work. He enrolled in an individual therapy program focused on identity and life transition. He began for the first time in his adult life keeping a journal, a practice that his therapist had recommended and that he had initially resisted with the mild contempt of an engineer for activities that did not produce measurable outputs, and that he had subsequently found, to his genuine surprise, to be the most clarifying thing he had ever done. He began volunteering with a youth mentorship program at a community center in St. Louis, work that had nothing to do with logistics or operations and everything to do with sitting with young people in their uncertainty and offering the company of a man who had learned, at 61, that uncertainty was not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be inhabited honestly. He could not have told you, at the end of that first year, whether the regret he had named on the stage had resolved. What he could tell you was that the question had changed shape, that it no longer felt like a verdict on his marriage, but like an accurate description of the self he had brought to it, and that the more clearly he understood that self, the more he could see that Loretta, with her full-hearted presence and her 31 years of coaxing beautiful things out of unpromising material, was exactly the person that self needed beside him. He told her this on a Tuesday evening, in their kitchen in St. Louis, without cameras or an audience or a game show format to provide structure. She listened to it with the complete attention she gave to everything that mattered. Then she said that she had been saying something similar about him for years, in the language of music, and that she was glad he had finally found the words. Steve Harvey spoke about the Whitfield episode once, in a format that did not require brevity, and his reflection was the most personal of any he had offered about a family from his show. I have made the mistake that Bernard was describing, he said. I have been a man who built a life and then looked at it and wondered whether I had built it toward something true. I am not unique in that. Most men of a certain age have stood in that particular doorway. He paused. What is unusual is when a man decides to walk through it instead of quietly closing it again. Bernard Whitfield walked through it. On television, in front of his wife and his children, and the full complexity of what he was feeling. And the woman he walked through it in front of did not run. She stayed at the table. He looked at the person interviewing him. That is what love looks like when it is fully grown, not the early version, the one that is confident and uncomplicated and does not yet know what it does not know. The later version, the one that has seen everything and chosen again anyway. The choir that Loretta directed that fall opened its season with a performance that drew its largest audience in 11 years. Bernard sat in the front row. He had been to every performance for 31 years. But the people beside him noted, without being able to fully explain the observation, that this time he appeared to be actually listening. not in the polite, dutiful manner of a spouse attending a spouse's professional event, but in the manner of a man encountering something for the first time, which, in the way that mattered, he was. If this story stayed with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. Every week we share the moments that remind us that honesty, even when it arrives late and costs something, is always the beginning of something more real. Share this with someone who is still sitting with a question they have not yet found the courage to ask.